Shape of distribution. The shape of distribution describes the visual distribution of data in a set. In other words, what does the data look like when graphed? When describing the shape of distribution, we usually use these five terms: symmetry, skew, peak, gap, and cluster. The first of these five terms is symmetry. Symmetry suggests the data is evenly distributed around a central point. Symmetry is probably much more easily visualized or seen than described. In these four examples, a butterfly, a dot plot, a histogram, and a box plot, I've drawn a red vertical line through the center of each. If you look to the left and to the right of those red lines, I think you'd say each of these pictures suggest symmetry. Information or data is evenly distributed. The left side and the right sides appear similar. These are symmetrical. Look at these five examples. Which graph or graphs are symmetrical? Think carefully. If you were to draw a line vertically through the middle of each graph, which of these would suggest it was symmetrical? Our second term is called skew. This suggests it's asymmetrical. In other words, it's not evenly distributed, or that the information or data is distorted to the left or to the right. In these examples, you can see dot plots, box plots, and histograms. We have asymmetry. In other words, if I were to draw a vertical line through the center of each of these graphs, the left sides and right sides would not look the same. You can see that the information or data falls off to the left or to the right. The direction of that fall is the direction of the skew. So, for example, if you looked at the dot plot at the top left, you can see the data falls off to the left. So this graph would be considered skewed left. If you look at the histogram in the middle of the slide, you'll see the data clearly falls off to the right. So that graph would very well be considered skewed right. Look carefully at these five examples. Which of these graphs are skewed right? Again, same five examples, only now, which graph or graphs are skewed left? Our third term, when speaking of shape of distribution, is peak, the highest point in a graph, indicating the value that's seen the most often. We know this is mode. You can clearly visualize a peak. Look at that dot plot. It's typically pretty easy to spot a peak in a dot plot. Where do you see the most dots? Here, the peak is at 2. In the histogram, the tallest bar. In this case, it's at 26 to 30. That's the peak. Now, you cannot identify a peak in a box plot. That's why there isn't a box plot example here. You can't see a peak in a box plot. Looking at these five examples, do you see peaks? Which graph or graphs show a peak or peaks? The next term is gap. Gap suggests an empty space or an interval in a data set. You can visualize a gap quite easily. That bridge has a missing piece. There's a gap between the left side and the right side of the bridge. Just as you can see, there's a gap in the dot plot between 31 and 34, or in the histogram between 40 and 50. Now, just like with a peak, you cannot see a gap in a box plot either. There are no box plot examples for peaks and gaps. That's not a graph where you can visualize these two things. In these 5 examples, do you see a gap or gaps? Which graph or graphs show a gap or gaps? Our last term is cluster. Cluster suggests data that's grouped closely together. You can see here that in the dot plot on the upper left, there are 2 clusters. There's data grouped closely together between 64 and 72. And then there's data grouped closely together again between 94 and 96. In the histogram at the bottom right, you can see there are 2 bars that stand out from the rest. There's a gap right there in the center of that histogram. The box plot also has a cluster. That cluster shows that in a box plot, each of the 4 parts, each of the 4 quartiles of a box plot has 25% of the data in that set. 1/4 of the data falls into each quartile. If you look at the quartile that's circled in red, look how narrow that quartile is. That says 1/4 of all the data is crammed closely together in that quartile of the box plot. A very narrow quartile suggests a cluster. So looking at these 5 examples, which graph or graphs show a cluster? Let's now wrap up the lesson. When we speak about shape of distribution, we're talking about what does the data look like on the graph. When you see the graph, do you see symmetry? If you drew a vertical line down the middle of that graph, would the data on that graph look the same on the left as it does on the right? If not, could it be skewed? Do you see data falling off to the right or off to the left? If you do, maybe that graph is skewed left or right. Do you see peaks when looking at dot plots and histograms or bar graphs? You can see peaks by simply looking at the tallest bar, the tallest stack of dots. Do you see gaps in that graph? Do you see portions of the graph where there isn't any data? Or in fact, do you see clusters where data appears to be grouped very closely together? Symmetry, skew, peak, gap, and cluster are ways that we describe the shape of distribution on a graph.